Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? If you're enjoying the show so far, remember to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheist United Studios.
M.L. Clark was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, but now calls Medellin, Colombia, home. A writer of humanist essays and speculative fiction, and also a translator of Colombian prose, Clark draws from an academic background in political science and literary histories of science to advocate for more expansive thinking about media literacy, science literacy, and the social contracts that shape our world. ML, it's great to have you here. Welcome to Beyond Atheism.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to talking with you. I always read your writing on Only Sky, so yeah, looking forward to it. I guess the first question, as Todd mentioned at the start, you're in Colombia. Why are you in Colombia right now? How did you get there?
Well, by plane.
Yes.
Hey now.
Easy question. This is great. Keep them coming. No, 5 years ago is when I emigrated from Canada, but the pathway there started in 2016. And there are two parts to the question. One is, why did I want to leave Canada? And why did I choose Colombia? So 2016, boy, gosh, what a year. In 2016, there were, of course, many different struggles. It hasn't been a really good century, obviously. And growing up in Canada, I am 13 generations Canadian. I'm Canadian through and through. Your listeners can't see me. I am extremely white, like a ghost. I have a very strong settler background in Canada, and I still very much believe that anyone who comes to Canada, if you want to be part of the Canadian project, try not to replicate our mistakes with colonialism and the oppression of Indigenous people. Great, welcome, you're Canadian. But the normal level of xenophobia and racism that already existed seemed to skyrocket in 2016. Unfortunately, what was happening in the United States was also informing Canada's social contract and Canada's discourse. And it was really upsetting to watch that happen, to see this sort of reduction of our political discourse to the same issues, the same problems over and over and over again. So deeply demoralizing to look at our social contract, our discourse, and to feel trapped, truly wondering, is this the same cycle of conversation that we're always going to be having? At the same time, other parts of the world were having different conversations. And 2016 was a very important year in Colombia, extremely important. I lived at that time in Kitchener-Waterloo, so I had a lot of displaced Colombian friends, and they didn't talk specifically about the experiences. It's a very complicated thing to be a displaced Colombian and displaced in many other parts of the world. You don't openly share much, but because they were my friends, I learned more about their culture, and I did a lot more research. And I was struck that while we were trapped in North America in these very tedious and oppressive cycles of discourse, Colombia was trying something extraordinary. It was trying to make a peace after over 50 years of war that would bring a guerrilla organization into peacetime governance. And in the process, this incredibly ambitious and difficult and fraught piece of legislation included creating pathways to restorative justice of kinds that we do not even begin to engage with in North America. And at the same time, the country was doing things in a legal framework around environment and trying to engage Indigenous actors in ways that, again, we can't seem to do in the North American environment. So this is a very long way of saying that I ached in 2016 for something different, and I did not know entirely what it is I needed to learn, but I just wanted to be part of a different conversation and to learn from a different conversation. And Colombia provided that, continues to provide that 5 years on.
Wow, that's fantastic. What do you notice in sort of the day-to-day life that's different for you in Colombia?
Oh, this is wonderful, because there was one other reason that I was extremely fascinated by my Colombian friends in particular in Canada. Canadians and folks in the United States too, a lot of us, we have a culture of complaint, and it's necessary. I don't mean to criticize us for it. It all comes out of a context. People are stressed out, they are stuck, mobility between classes has not changed much. So people have to perform a kind of worthiness to they're working towards something, and they're showing you how hard they're working by complaining about how hard work was or how difficult their commute was or all the different problems they're dealing with to show that they're worthy of something better. That's the sort of Protestant bootstrap mentality. My Colombian friends and a few other immigrant communities were always smiling, and I could not figure out why. How could they had been displaced? They couldn't talk about a lot of the reasons they'd been displaced. It was very difficult in many ways. They experienced xenophobia and racism in Canada, but their attitude was so different. When I moved to Colombia, I got to see what it's like to live in a culture where everyone accepts that life is hard. There's no myth of meritocracy. And because there's no myth of meritocracy, there's no performance. So the attitude, the positivity here is not a toxic positivity. It is a culture of gratitude for what one has, especially in Medellin. I'm not going to dwell too much on certain eras in Medellin's past, but because it was very much a collective trauma, people just understand life is hard, sometimes things are hard, and there's not as much judgment or stigma on the individual. And what a difference it makes to live in an environment like that, where the pressure's off the individual to perform within a myth of meritocracy that we all on one level know in Canada and the United States is not, it's never really been aligned with reality, but we can't quite escape it. You have to escape it as a group, as a culture. And this culture has many communities that have collectively recognized that. And as a result, it changes one's attitude. They lean into gratitude a lot more.
Hmm. So gratitude seems to be a big part of it. Acceptance is part of it. I'm curious as like where your like the background that informs your humanism. Is it something you were raised with, or were you raised with religion and you found humanism through it?
No, I was raised in a free thinking household. In as much, and when I say this, I mean that both my parents tried, they made an effort to not let us know what they believed or didn't believe, and they were very open to us exploring what we needed to. And I was fortunate to grow up in Toronto. Because I grew up in Toronto, you were exposed to the world. So growing up in my childhood, I got to visit everything. I got to visit a synagogue. I got to go to a Catholic mass with a friend. I got to go to a Presbyterian church in the traditional white context, as well as a Korean version. Obviously, there are Zen Buddhist temples you get to experience, and you get to see how many different ways of being exist and coexist, especially in Toronto. The other thing is, I lived for a little while in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is a lot more stratified, but Colombia feels a little bit more like growing up in Toronto, where you have languages around you, people living in completely different contexts or cultures, and it's fine. Nobody is stressing out over it. It's just, it's what it means to live in a world of, well, now 8 billion, not when I was growing up, but that comfort with difference and being able to hold in tension different ways of being can be naturalized a little more. I'm not trying to suggest that everyone in Toronto is as enlightened in that particular way, but you can lean into that if you want to there. So I grew up very much atheist, and at the same time, I grew up fully aware that I was living in a world with many different traditions, many different cosmologies.
So it sounds like it was this sense of humanism was sort of like self-taught, a little autodidactic, a little experiential. Is that accurate to say?
I would say so, yes. The term humanism didn't really come into my active vocabulary until university. And again, that was a little bit of a culture shock because I thought growing up in Toronto I'd seen everything. But if you go to a university like University of Waterloo, which is about an hour and a half away from Toronto, suddenly you're surrounded by a lot of folks who are coming from small rural communities. They're often white dominant. They're often a lot more prejudiced in many different ways. And that's where I met my first slate of biblical literalists my age who would start to identify me as the atheist. That became the moniker that was placed on me in that context. And that was such a striking shift from what I'd grown up with in Toronto. And it also led to a little bit of resistance because atheism, for me, identifies only what I don't believe in. It has no positive qualities in terms of clarifying what I do believe in. And I find it extremely dangerous as a label because there are so many implied meanings that people will impose on it. They'll suggest that an atheist is automatically or intrinsically scientifically informed, for instance, which is not true at all. And there's the
Right.
idea that if
Yeah.
you are an atheist, you're automatically a critical thinker. That's, you've done the work you need to do. You can sit on your laurels for the rest of your life, and that's again extremely dangerous. So I pursued positive identity because I do not like being framed solely by what I do not believe in.
Yeah, we've learned that the only thing that makes you an atheist is not believing in God, and sometimes that's not even true.
Oh
There are
my goodness,
atheists who
yes.
do believe in God. So it's a really empty set. And you've in taken on this positive form, or positive ideal, which is humanism. Could you? Well, you're also a global humanist now, living internationally. What does it mean in sort of practical terms to be a global humanist?
Great. I'm going to go back a little bit to explain the global in relation to other modifiers that I've also used. One specifically, secular humanist, is really important as a modifier to identify that there are other forms of humanism. A lot of times people think that humanism automatically means atheistic, and that's not true. There are lots of religious humanists as well, and it's extremely important to use those modifiers sometimes to highlight elements that are important to the main definition, but sometimes taken for granted or overlooked. In that same vein, I use global humanist to emphasize a quality that I wish were naturalized to the concept of humanism, but in practice is not. When I see a lot of people who identify as humanist within the North American culture or Western culture, especially to a lot of British communities will have this issue as well, they really are localized. They do see themselves a little bit bounded by a nation state or at least the Western paradigm. And I less often see them thinking about humanism in terms of the family of now 8 billion. So when we talk about the project of humanism on a philosophical level, putting aside medieval humanism, which is not our concern, we're talking about contemporary humanism,
Uh-huh.
we are talking about prioritizing human agency and pursuing as much as we can the optimization and maximization of human agency. We recognize as humanists that we are agents. We are actors in the universe. We are important actors in the universe. And this allows us to align with, as secular humanists, with folks who are religiously humanist. They too, they might have a different cosmology, believe that humans are important actors. Great, we can work together on this. There is another component that's really important to turning this theory into praxis, and that is in order to maximize and optimize human agency, we need to be as informed as possible about the world. We need as comprehensive and as accurate a data set as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of Western forms of humanism fall back on classic atheist discourse and only focus on certain ways of thinking, certain ways of moving through the world, and certain fields of study. And so they'll often forget things that's really quite cute. Things like human behavioralism will be left outside of their arguments or left outside their understanding of the world. They'll focus on rigid facts from biology or archaeology or geology, and they'll forget that we also have a body of data about how to argue and actually how to change minds that needs to be incorporated in how we talk about all of this. When you bring in the rest of the world, you bring in the rest of a body of data that's necessary in order to empower the whole world. But I do find that a lot of our discourse, when we talk about humanism, suggests that we're thinking about the whole species, suggests we're thinking about the whole of the human race, but we're not. We are still localized within our nation state or cultural traditions.
Right. And then I guess this is in some sense informed by, living in your case, living in Colombia, outside where you were born. And I wonder I guess maybe what would you change, like, practically about humanists and atheists today? Like, what should they be doing different? Or what would you wish they would be doing?
Perfect question. Perfect question. Oh my goodness. There is a kind of argument that is often fallen back. We fall back on a certain argument when we think about a world beyond religion. We think we just need to educate or argue people into a better position. And what I see, especially in Colombia, but not just in Colombia, many parts of the world, Colombia is a very Catholic country, culturally Catholic. It infuses everything. In large part, it infuses the lives of people here because none of their other needs are being met, because there is a lot of suffering. And it is extremely frustrating that in the West there is a reliance on arguing our way out of a position. This is something that goes back to that classic moment in atheist history, the new atheist movement, where we are enamored with the idea that an eloquent debate will change the world, when what we truly need, if we want to move to a position of maybe less decision making driven by some fairly arbitrary traditional mythologies, or beliefs in something that's a little more grounded in fact. We need to do the hard work of allowing people the agency to make those choices and improve their lives. And that requires fixing the problems of poverty and disease and war. And all of those should be our concerns if we truly want to move to a world that is less. For me, it's not the ultimate goal to be less religious, but all of those folks who think we just need to get rid of religion and then everything will be fine have it backwards. We need to work on all of these underlying problems first. And it's a very interesting, complicated position here because a lot of folks here, all they can say if I help them with something, I'm in a position sometimes to help folks here. All they can say is, Dios le bendiga, God bless you. That's all they can say. That's all they have to give. And in that Western paradigm, that would be, oh, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. God
Mhm.
didn't help you. I helped you.
Yeah.
It's just like,
Yeah.
that is the only thing this family lacking dignity in this moment because they're on the street begging because nothing has been provided for them in terms of social welfare. That's all they have to extend kindness and to connect human to human. And the Western discourse, with its pride and its fascination with debate, overlooks what we know to be the ways in which we can improve the world tangibly, concretely, that may also in time lead to a reduction in religious fervor. But we have to work on
Mm.
those basics first.
Yeah. So this comes to something that I know I struggle with, and that's like communicating across that boundary to a religious worldview, where very often it's, one being marked as an atheist. That's an issue. The other thing being just that we see the world very different, epistemologically and ontologically, even in terms of like where values come from, right? Are values absolute or are they relative? What's the source of morality? All of these things, but it makes it super difficult to communicate things like what you're saying, clearly and meaningfully in a way that facilitates organization, facilitates reaching common goals, right? There's a separation between us. It's very difficult to communicate, and it prevents us from reaching our common goals. And like you said, it's the discourse we're familiar with in the sort of atheist landscape is religion is a problem. You get rid of the problem, and then we can reach our goals. That's the way we do it. But it sounds like, and what I've read in your work is that no, we can do it. We can reach across. This is on us. And we've heard a few different ways to do it. Like radical listening, where you just listen, and like street epistemology, where you're getting a dialogue and you constantly ask questions. Um, is Are there other ways? What's something that's worked for you? What are you finding very practical in Colombia or just in other parts of the world that helps you connect with people, find this commonality as a global humanist?
Right. So that's a really important point. And there's two things you've actually asked. So I'm going to answer your question right now, and then I'm going to double back to an implied comment that we also need to deal with. With respect to reaching across the divide, I find it's really important to remind them that they're a human outside of their faith tradition. And it is really difficult for many folks who don't have anything but their faith tradition. And in Canada, I felt this too. In Canada, and in Colombia, I have always connected with people on the street, and I've always been a person who tries to be present with need. And in Canada, as well as in Colombia, but in Canada, it's different. You have folks who want to prove that they are religious so that you can see they're a person of value and worth helping. And it is the most heartbreaking thing when someone tries to say they don't have anything, they're stressed out, they just need, a cup of coffee on a really cold day. I'm from Canada, so they're pretty, half the year's cold days. But the way that they do that is they try to say, I'm a good Christian, honestly, I'm a good
Right.
Christian. And
Right.
to have to remind them, you're a human. You're a human. You deserve to be able to be warm on a
Mm,
cold day. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they've never heard that, or they haven't
mm,
heard it in so long. Recently, I'm right now working actually quite successfully. It's just taking a little while. There's an evangelical street preacher here. He is my newspaper guy. He walks up and down with the crossword that I love, but he also constantly is trying to evangelize at me, and so it's been difficult to find a balance. But learning about his story and what's brought him to this really helps. There was one point where he said he had to believe in God because otherwise he'd go to hell, and he didn't want to go to hell. When his wife died in COVID, he wanted to kill himself, but he knew that if he did, he'd go to hell, and that's why he's still here. And I stopped him. It's like, I'm really glad you're still here. Your life matters. It's a value that you're here. And he cried. And it's not as when I'm not trying to suggest that suddenly that magically transformed things. We're still working in terms of seeing each other as humans first, but it's a reminder that these church groups that are most radical, that are most extreme, are responding to a need that nobody else is. And if we can recognize that and we can honor the need, we can help to move the conversation forward. So, in answer to your second question, I'll go back to the first one, the implied one. Being present and existing in the same space is really important. Being someone who just sees the human in the other person and is willing to say, hey, there are other things that we can talk about and build around. I also have a young earth creationist aunt, and she and I get along quite well, even though she thinks we are very near the end times, because we resonate over our work trying to help people in need. So we find other ways to connect around that conversation. So this leads to your implied question as well. How do we bridge the divide? We also have to bridge the divide with ourselves. There are a lot of people within the atheist community who are also suffering from a need that they don't necessarily realize they have. We in North America are struggling to find place for ourselves, stability for ourselves, socioeconomic stability. And for a lot of us, that atheist label is really important to establishing where we fit in. So the idea of a world beyond this divide means a world where our label no longer matters, which means our purpose, our own kind of evangelizing, not really evangelizing, but our own mission in the streets in some ways is going to come to an end. And that means there'll be no identity for us. There'll be nothing else for us. When we stop consuming ourselves in that identity too, and we remember that we have other components, then we can start to do the work of seeing those other components in other people. But if that identity is really important to our socioeconomic stability, to our sense of self, to our sense of place in the universe, we're not going to be as willing to let it go. We'll stay in the fight. We'll keep building the fight. We'll antagonize our neighbor over something ridiculous in the Bible because it also gives us a sense of purpose. That's dangerous.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask, like, sort of on that point, like you write for Only Sky, obviously, which is kind of a secular website, and I wonder,
What?
like,
Shocking.
but do you think? I mean, why do you kind of come at it through that angle? I mean, like, or do you think, we might just be more focused politically on more left wing politics or something like that, rather than kind of from a sort of secular atheist humanist framing? Why why do you come at it from that perspective?
Well, let's question the word secular. What are we talking about when we talk about a secular space? Because even that is a void. And the idea is, what are we going to fill our secular space with? Unfortunately, in North America, and in many different atheist movements come before, a lot of folks want to resist the religion in its superficial forms, but are very comfortable with the structures of society that were built by religion. We have so many frameworks in North America, and the way we engage with justice systems, the way that we organize rights and laws, are drawn from that particular tradition. And we're quite comfortable with a lot of those power structures. We just want to get rid of the God concept at top. That's, for a lot of people, that's sufficient for secularism. And I do go a little bit further than that in saying that our structures need a rehaul. And in order to do that, we do need to, again, move towards positive values instead of constantly being in a reactive mode. We need to imagine the better world we want to live in. Not easy, and it's ongoing work, but it's necessary for us to be moving in that direction instead of resting on our laurels all the time, content in the knowledge that at least we're a little bit better, or that's the way a lot of some folks within the atheist paradigm would put it, at least we're a little bit smarter, at least we're a little bit better than the people who believe X, Y, and Z. It's not sufficient. Yeah.
So, how young in Earth are we talking about here?
Oh, in terms of my aunt?
Yeah,
Oh, 600 years, yeah, give or take.
six
Oh,
hundred
sorry, not
years.
600, sorry.
Six
Correction there,
thousand. Oh,
6,000,
okay.
yeah.
2000.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
Yeah.
wow.
Mhm.
Yeah. Has she ever dropped any knowledge on you, like any weird fact, and you're like, yeah, okay, maybe it is that young.
Oh goodness, no. But again, it is all about. Sometimes she's just so excited to be able to lead in her congregation, and so she'll share a little piece of the sermon she gave, and I'll talk about the rhetoric that she used and the structure that she used. It was like that was, it was a really interesting framing. You started with the personal anecdote, and then you moved into that because for her, it's community. It allows her to connect with other people, and so it also defangs the issue. I find it so much easier when we defang it, when we don't treat it necessarily as intimidating and overwhelming and powerful as a lot of folks within these movements want to believe it is. When you just use like, oh, that's really nice. the same way you would if someone shows you your crochet work. Okay, some crochet projects are amazing and impressive, and I don't want
Yeah.
to belittle that work. But my point is
Uh,
to normalize it instead of putting it up on
uh,
that pedestal or allowing it to stay on that pedestal, to just see it as one of many activities that human beings do. And that takes away some of the power. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so your writing, you cover so much, such a wide diversity of topics in your writing. I mean, it's quite impressive. And one thing I wonder about is what is your process for news gathering? I guess is like, what is your process for staying informed? Is there some sort of like systematic way you go about it, or what? Because for me, it's really not at all systematic. So I wonder about for you. It's always, yeah, interesting to see how other people get informed.
Well, that's the funny thing, because there are uses, shockingly enough, even in our day and age, for university education. But one of the most important is learning how to study and learning how to do research. And if that's the only skill, that two things. In terms of humanities education, you should learn how to do research properly, and you should learn how to hold ideas in tension. If you can do those two things, congrats, you've gotten your humanities education. But it's really difficult to be able to do that, especially in a world where once you leave university, you're usually no longer able to get all the lovely articles you want. You can't always access things the
Right.
same way that you want
Yes.
to. So you do have to be a little bit selective. I made good use of my time with access to as many archives as possible when I was younger. Now there is a sense of, if I'm going to do a deep dive on a topic, I will do as deep a dive as I can in that particular moment and immerse myself as much as possible. And I do recognize that I can build on the work that I've done. So, for instance, if I'm working on something related to finance or petroleum and its impact on the world, I will recognize I do not have to cover everything right now. Focus as much as you can, get these particular points as accurate as you can, and then you can return to it later and you can build on that work later. So essentially, I am setting up my own archive with my past work. So the links that I put in are allowing me to go back to previous articles and to make sure that I have the data I need for the next in that particular series. So I've created a little bit of a thread for myself in that way. When it comes to other news, I mean, I follow news in two languages, working on a third. Arabic is very challenging, but I am
Oh wow.
trying my gosh darn best. It has definitely helped, because I can follow Arabic Twitter a lot better when there are crises in the Middle East than I ever could before, and I can see things, and then I can check to see how mainstream Western news is reporting on it. So useful, but challenging. Yeah. So we have every day is one thing, but when you're talking about those articles, they are deep dives, and I build them in a way that allows me to use them as resources going forward for other
Right.
work.
Yeah. And what are your go-to news sites?
Oh, well, we've talked about this off recording, but I will read quite widely because I want to see how things are being misrepresented, and that is really important. I often get very frustrated with the Guardian, because the Guardian, especially its reporting on Colombia, is always playing into Western ideas about Colombia, and it's excruciating to see that everything that happens here is constantly framed to fit an existing ideology or expectation, instead of inviting curiosity. And then it makes me wonder, gosh, I know the truth about Colombia. How many other places that it's reporting
yeah.
on have the same issue? So
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
yeah, I
Yeah.
try to read as widely in as many mainstream spaces as I can, precisely to see how people are being misinformed. When I read, I'm always reading critically, and I'm always wondering about the headline, and I'm always wondering about what comes underneath it. I also, just for fun, love to follow a lot of science news. And again, even science news is dangerous, because quite a few science news bulletins won't link to the original source, they won't link to the actual study, and that too is quite frustrating. Oh, the Guardian's the worst for this as well, for mainstream news. But then when you see it in science sites, you're thinking, you have a responsibility. Why? So for me, when I'm reading news, it's not just to read news. I want to hear how stories are being spun. And so I have a different reading practice, and I will just read as widely as I can in order to understand what everyone else is interpreting. It's exhausting, because then you're constantly frustrated with, okay, this bad story is now going to be our trend cycle for the next 2 days, and it's going to take a long time for any kind of corrective practice to fix even a part of the damage it's done. But Such
Right.
is our
And
world.
yeah, and this is, I mean, in terms of media literacy, which I mean, we could talk for hours on that alone. But one of the things you brought up is like recognizing the bias that's inherent in something, or like once you recognize a newspaper has a particular bias, like The Guardian, you know that they're in the bag for labor, they're mainstream labor. Okay, once we know that, we can read past that bias. And like you said, like when you start following the links, and I've done this in a lot of science reporting, they just link to other articles that do it, and all they're kind of doing is copy pasting the abstract, right? And you have to actually either read the article or find some really obtuse coverage of it, and then you never see it when the article either goes to publication or when it gets refuted, right? That's another thing.
Yes, right. Yes. Yeah.
Right. So, and what all of this implies, though, is that one, it's a lot of learning. You have to you have to learn how to do something and then actively read, actively seek out news. Where most of what we're dealing with now is people receive news very, very passively, and they become part of the echo chamber. Or you have to do a lot of work. You just have to do a lot of work, even to do a pretty, just to get a good understanding of what's going on, to really dig into it. But if you're not either doing the work or being critical of it, you're going to get stuck, right? And this is one of the things that puts us in a bad place. If we just kind of project this out to the future, right? Say, well, okay, we're passive receptors, we're consumers of news, right? Fox News, the product isn't news, it's an audience, and then they sell that audience to advertisers. And if we follow this trend, basically we're all just receptives of nonsense forever. But you seem to have a bigger view of the possible. Is that fair to say? I can't remember where I read it. I think it was in your work about it's easier to imagine.
Oh, that's not me. That's a
That's not
classic.
you. I know.
That's a
I can't. I
classic.
think you
It,
quoted it
yeah,
somewhere, and
it is.
and I've been
Yeah.
reading Mark Fisher again.
Oh, congratulations. Always good to return. The numbers sometimes
It
change,
is.
but the concepts are exactly the same. Nothing's changed
It's
at the
amazing, and that yeah,
theoretical level.
it's so rich, and
Mhm.
and there's always something more to find in there. But the idea, basically, what he says is it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? It's like we're just stuck in this hopeless loop. But this is something you see a way out of. Is that fair to say? Have you found new political
Oh
possibilities
no,
living
now
abroad, or
you're setting me
just?
up in terms of like a profit. No, 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 no. I think it's extremely
I'm setting you up, Mel. I'm trying to say you're imaginative, you're creative.
okay, but as long as I'm
It's
not getting no
easier to
Scientology,
do.
then
Just
okay.
Yeah.
sign up for your 6-week course, and then
I'm
you learn
saying,
the truth.
No, this is great. It's a send up for me to start Scientology 2.0. I
Yes.
yes.
we'll see. We'll see. No, the what is important is to put yourself in a position where you're looking for those possibilities. That's extremely important. You're right, we're in reactive modes. And even what we're talking about, I want to be a little bit gentle with the world of journalism. It's been gutted completely. You have these corporations which have been systemically going into small towns and destroying the best news coverage at its source. And so there used to be a much stronger, more robust tradition. It's not that there weren't always yellow rags; they always existed. But we did have some countervailing forces that have less room right now and less, certainly fewer resources with which to try to fight back. And so, yes, we all are consuming content. And this is even, it's quite amusing that people will be worried about AI when we have been in the state of regurgitated content for quite some time. That's been the
Yeah.
state of our news for the last 2 decades.
Right.
It's crushing. But the important thing is my personal example is when I left Canada, I did not know exactly what it is I was going to learn. I just knew I needed to learn something. And so I moved in that direction. And that's something that I think is really important for folks to try to do in whatever circumstances they find themselves in, is to try to move themselves in the direction of imagining that there might be other ways, that you are not inevitably trapped in one particular cycle, one particular way of doing discourse. It's really hard at first because we are habituated often for our entire lives, and my social contract from Canada is still a part of me because it was a part of my life for the first 32 years. That's not going to change. That's been part of how I was conditioned, how I was raised. but you can work on changing those habits. And I think that's something that we often give over. We say we can't do anything because, the media is gone, because our systems are completely taken over by corporate monopolies. Well, in some ways, actually, there's a lovely term I started putting into use last year. Eco nihilism is actually not a bad kind of nihilism. It's actually quite reassuring for folks who move within certain parts of that movement, because they accept that climate change is here. You can't stop climate change, you can mitigate it. You can try to work with what is happening. And that, for some people, it takes a burden off of them. They don't have to fix everything. They just have to fix the forest near them. Just have to work on the water quality near them. And suddenly that makes things possible again. So sometimes when we set these big standards for self, we have to stop racism in our lifetime. We have to stop sexism in our lifetime. That is a tall and demoralizing order. Whereas, give yourself a little bit of room to imagine more concrete, more localized possibilities, and suddenly you improve your own agency, which allows you to improve the agency of those around you.
Yeah, I think you're right that the amount of injustice, kind of like when you start thinking about the world and thinking about all the problems there are, it can be overwhelming, and then it can lead you into a place where it's just you just throw your hands up and that you think there's nothing to be done. Um, I wanted to ask you about you raised this issue about the social contract a couple times, and I wonder if you could talk more about that, and maybe in the context of Colombia. What do you mean by social
Sure.
contract
Okay.
and so on?
So
Yeah.
the social contract is it's implicit. We did not come out of the womb in whatever way we did and immediately sign a paper. So we're not that if unless you did, congratulations. I mean, the hand grip of a newborn is quite something. So you put a
Right.
pen in their hand, maybe they could sign something. Generally speaking, though, it's something that we are born into and expected to follow the same way that one is expected to follow actual contracts, literal contracts later in life, without ever having been made fully conscious at the outset of what we were signing up for. So we are born into a culture that provides certain state parameters. For instance, this is how our state or our province views the death penalty. This is how we view morality around this particular concept. And you have agreed to this tacitly just by being raised in it. You don't fully recognize it, but it is a part of who you are. And that contract is something that later on feels just so natural to us. It's like a part of our moral fiber. It feels like we're locked into it. And that can obviously limit lots of opportunities. The easiest way to move from that notion of a social contract framed by your sense of community, your sense of culture, is to be exposed to others, but you sometimes really have to go quite far to do so. So, for instance, we talked about how I was in Toronto, lots of different people from lots of different parts of the world, but we were all still in Toronto, we were all still in Canada. We also had this overarching, abiding social contract that framed how people thought about what is a crime, what is an acceptable thing to do about another human being. And it was all implicit. It was background. We're swimming in it without fully recognizing what we're swimming in. Sometimes you have to go really far to recognize what the details of your contract have been saying to you all the time in your life. And in Colombia, I'll give this example. Colombia is handling a very difficult migration crisis much better, much, much better than the United States. And it does so because its social contract, the implicit underlying terms that people are raised with when they talk about the idea of an illegal person or a person who is displaced, it's different on that core level in many complicated ways. Colombia, in the past, Colombians had to flee their homes, and so many of them recognized that in other eras, Venezuela was safe harbor for them. So now Venezuelans need safe harbor, and so I think it was just last week they said 4% of the country is now technically Venezuelan because of that's how many people have been coming over, and there's a sense of dignity that people deserve to try to live, and it hasn't been easy because the country is still a very poor country in many ways. There aren't always services available. It doesn't have to be easy for people in general to still feel like their gut tells them this is the right thing to do, but it's not really their gut. It's the social contract that they've been raised up in, the cultural that feels like this is still what we have to do. Whereas in the United States, a lot of people are acculturated, built up in this contract of if you want to come over here, you have to come over exactly the way that people in my family came over from the years 1940 to 1970. Before then, maybe they crossed a different contract, but we're not going to talk about that. But the the those things are so ingrained that we can't even talk about them properly. We can't even have a coherent conversation about what is actually moral, what is actually ethical, because some of these elements are signed in our core, and they have been since birth. And it takes a lot to recognize that there are other completely different ways to structure society and to think about human value within it. I'm going to give one other example that was quite unfortunate. I don't remember the name of the shooter. Maybe it's not a good idea to talk about the name of the shooter. The Batman theater shooting. You remember that one? Out of all of the
Oh yeah,
terrible,
yep.
Oh, in
yeah,
Colorado,
There's
I
so
think.
many. Who
I
can
know
keep
it's
track of
just
them?
it's so horrifying. So when that happened, I remember watching the forums and I was horrified. I think there was a young man. I think he was 24, 26, somewhere in that age range, and he had been shot going to the movie, and his hospital bills were $1 million for being shot for going to the Batman. And the thing is that in the United States, the forums and news sites were constantly saying, well, he deserved it for not having gotten insurance. And that was something that's just so normative to a culture that is seeing that there's a certain fixed value for healthcare when that's not true, when that's fluid, when it depends on your context, that there is conditionality to care in general, and that people should be responsible for their actions up to even going out to a movie is no longer safe. They should have known better. All of those things are embedded in a culture that has accepted many terrible conditions and doesn't even realize that those are the terms of the contract that they have implicitly grown up with and accept without having ever had a conscious moment to sit down and think, is that actually the best way to structure a society? So unfortunate, but it really does shape everything about how we see the world.
Yeah. And sort of following from that point, you also write fiction as well. And maybe you can, as a really clever segue, you can maybe talk about how that sort of thinking informs your fiction writing, or sort of like how there's a mutual aspect to that.
Definitely. I mean, fiction is also something that grows. So I've had periods in my fiction when I focus on different elements, but social contract theory, the idea of that thing that is embedded within us that we haven't quite given name to, that we don't have vocabulary for, but which strongly guides us and guides our sense of possibility in the world, is something that I have been wrestling with in my fiction, speculative fiction, primarily, pretty much through all periods in my life. And I can see certain periods when I was struggling with a sense of guilt and shame and struggle to enact agency. I could see that I was fighting for some sort of agency myself. And in a lot of the later work and the work going forward, there's a lot more about really offering different representations of society. So that's why speculative fiction with sci-fi components can be really useful, because you can create other cultures, other alien civilizations, and use them as a contrast and to imagine different possibilities. But I know that when I look through my own history of fiction, a lot of that fiction was about giving myself agency to think outside of those original conditions, and the sci-fi components definitely help in that regard. But any opportunity to imagine a near future as well that might look a little bit different than the one that we seem to be moving toward is an opportunity to provide people with more possibilities and to fight back on that fatalism. So a lot of near future fiction and a lot of fiction with speculatives and sci-fi possibilities to present alternatives to myself and then hopefully to readers too. Yeah.
Wow, this is ML. You've got so much going on here. We've got
Yeah.
essays, speculative fiction, translation work, studying Arabic.
Mm.
My goodness.
We're all very brief witnesses to the cosmos. So I do think it's useful to try to make the most of what time we have. I think I remember when I was younger, I would love to be able to source this, but I'm just going to say that it affected me when I read it. I have no idea if the source is accurate now, that once you've hit the age of 20, you have lived longer than about half of the human species ever got a chance to. And so that's probably a little bit rounded and a little bit fuzzy. But I remember when I first heard that, it pretty much calmed me. A lot of people would always be like, oh no, I've turned 25. I'm so old. I'm 30. I haven't achieved my goals. And I'm sure that I will continue to hear that all my life. But I think to myself, wow, I had another spin around the sun. This is amazing. What did I do with it? What am I going to do with the next? Um, Especially because sometimes we've been talking about this in terms of how frustrating a lot of our systems are. I'm very humbled by it, because when I was a kid, we would look at history and we would see things laid out as if there was coherence and order and structure and plans and people who knew what they were doing. And then as you get older, you realize, no, no, almost nobody knew what they were doing in these circumstances. You have United States presidents who are drunk throughout the entirety of their terms in office, and
Yes.
really critical periods.
Yeah.
Right.
It's quite horrifying when, as an adult, you discover that everyone is trying to do the best they can with the information that they have and the body of experience that they bring to new environments. So also that also makes me feel like, in order to improve my options in the future, I need to be giving myself as many different other ways of thinking about the world now, so that I'm more open to those possibilities. But it's difficult. It's ongoing work, and we're just very fortunate that there are a lot of other people covering all the fields that we can't cover in our life. So we work together on this. Family of 8
Hmm.
billion. Yeah.
Definitely. Speaking of things that possibilities and things that we can do, ML, we have a speed round.
I love
Again,
this.
it's not a
Yes.
gotcha game.
No, no.
It's
I
called.
listened to a few of them. They're very endearing.
Mhm.
Yeah. I do
They're
have to
fun. We
say
should,
though,
yeah,
yeah, go
they're
ahead.
meant to be fun, and I hope they
Yeah.
are. I think
It's
you'll
yeah.
enjoy this.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
don't think anybody, I didn't hear weeping, but you might have cut it out. I have no idea. I do want I do want to say though, but just before we start, the idea of the global humanist is going to be especially interesting, because I think a global humanist necessarily, by definition, would have multiple peaks on the moral landscape, because I have my way of being a global humanist, but I can't impose it on every other culture without necessarily replicating exactly the problems that I complain about in terms of Western humanism constantly imposing
Mm,
itself on others. So I'll be speaking as one peak on the moral
Okay.
landscape.
okay.
You might be too humble for this
Many.
game. This is all about telling others what to do.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, telling others what they can't do,
Yeah.
perhaps. All right, then we'll start with an easy one then. Can a true global humanist, these are all yes or no questions, but you can stretch out the answer. You can add an explanation. Can a true global humanist believe in God?
Yes.
Oh, that's
Hmm.
pretty easy.
Yeah. Because again, I set up my definition of humanism to include secular and religious varieties. So
And
that,
religious humanists.
yeah,
Ah,
exactly.
very clever. So what's the big difference then between, say, just like a humanist and a global humanist? If you're adding these modifiers, as I've noticed you want to do.
Yes, no,
Yeah.
exactly. So
What
I
would
sometimes use the secular as a modifier to emphasize that there are other options. Again, I'm always about
mm.
building other options. So I'm secular humanist. There exist Jewish humanists. Most certainly
uh,
there are Jewish humanists, Christian humanists, Muslim humanists, and it's important to create space for other people to fill up the rest of the range with their identities. And then the global humanist, again, is somebody who's really trying to think outside of that particular paradigm, that social contract they were born in, recognizing that they are part of something much bigger, the family of 8
mm,
billion that we talked about. Tricky,
yeah,
difficult, but an important thing to strive toward.
yes. And very different from a local humanist, I guess.
All right.
Oh,
Yes.
the regional. Well, when you talk about, when I was talking, I didn't mean to be critiquing Britain too much. They have a lot on their plate right now. But the humanist
Yes.
literature that I often see out of Britain is very focused on the nation. It's quite fascinating to see that it has a
Mm.
very strongly regional feel to it. Even when a lot of those humanists will do work with other countries, it always feels like it's talking to and narrowly focused on one particular demographic. And that is something that hopefully as humanists we can try to avoid doing, is talking as if we're assuming we're only going to be heard by other Westerners or other people within our
Mm,
region, but imagining an actually global audience.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mm.
Oh, this is a tangent. I know we this is where already we have only done one question. We're already off a
This is
tangent, but
great. I love this.
actually, I was wondering about the in Colombia if there's much of a secular or like atheist humanist movement there,
Yes,
like an
there is.
organized movement.
It was very sweet. There was one other person, you've had her on, Anya.
Oh yeah,
She
yeah.
she came over and
Mm,
she wrote a piece for Only Sky, and it was a very endearing piece because it reminded me. Oh yes, I remember being new to Colombia and still learning everything, and just absorbing what one had. So she had the impression of a Westerner coming over, and she saw that there was a humanist candidate for president, but she's like, but he didn't win, so obviously there's still a problem for the country. I was like, that's a good start. But there actually is a very strong humanist movement here in Colombia, and you have a lot of folks in university settings who comfortably talk about humanism, write books about humanism. It is a part of the conversation. So it's a different framework, in part because Catholicism is an immersive culture here. There has less of a threat. There's less of a sense of a threat when you have other discourses. Whereas in North America, a lot of Catholic cultures, evangelical cultures have built their way of talking about themselves in a struggle against a secular order. But here, because there's so much, it's everywhere, it's saturated. You actually do get quite a few interesting other discourses allowed to coexist without being seen as a threat. So it's an interesting and very different conversation.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Moving along. Can a true global humanist thank others for praying for them?
Yes. We actually talked about this example too. I know when you were writing the questions, you hadn't heard my answer.
Yeah.
But we talked
Yeah.
about this in terms of the people that I help on the street who have nothing. Sometimes they will
Hmm.
take my hand and they will pray over me. And that's the only thing that they can do out of thanks for being seen as a human. And it's always awkward for me because it's not like I can say as like, you too. It's like,
Hmm.
Yeah.
it's really awkward because I do not fake these things with them. So
Yeah,
I
but
want
no, I mean, this ML. I think it's the follow
to,
up that we're really itching for.
sure.
Is what do you say? Because we get it here, and we know a lot of times it's kind of like it feels kind of backhanded when someone tells us that they're praying for us. Like, okay,
Yeah.
what are you praying for? And like, it feels like a slight. It is. There's an insult in there somewhere.
There
Um,
is in that
but
context. So it's like, I'll pray for you. Oh no,
yeah,
that's very different than
Yeah.
somebody who is
yeah,
thanking you the only way they know how. Thank
yeah.
you. I will keep your family in my prayers. Bless you, bless you, bless you. That
Mm,
is so context matters. The other
yes.
kind, the other kind I really only experienced in Canada. Here you don't quite get that. It's a much more delicate. This is a country too where a lot of folks are atheist except in their mother's house. And that's just there's a sense of like there is a very quiet sense of Catholicism
Uh,
as the dominant culture, but not necessarily the way that most people move through the universe. Just not an open conversation always the same way. So, yeah, it is difficult for folks in the United States or in Canada because it is sometimes they're fight words, sometimes they're specifically trying to bait.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you know what? I usually at the end, it's usually at the end of a conversation. It's like, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Just don't let it have power over you. Oh, I've used this example before. Did you guys ever see Merlin, the TV series from the 1990s? Not the more recent one, the one with Sam Neill.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
Sam Neill is the actor in
In
a
what?
mini series, Merlin, from 1998, I believe it aired.
No,
Okay,
no.
I love this particular scene. I use it as my example. At the end, Queen Mab has worked her mischief. She's ruined so much, and she wants to keep ruining more. So she needs people to engage with her so that she can keep
Mm,
ruining more destinies. But Merlin refuses. So Queen Mab is screaming at him, trying everything as I love you, you're not like a son, etc. And Merlin finally says, we forget you, Queen Mab. Go join your sister in the lake and be forgotten. And he and all
mm,
the other people there just turn and walk away. They disengage. And I
mm,
feel like there is a component in a lot of those baiting versions of I'll pray
mm,
for you. They're looking for the fight. They want to get a rise out of you. And if you can
mm.
just essentially say, hey, this has no power over me, that's nice.
Yeah.
There are other ways to remind people I see the human behind you. That's nice that that's a part of who you are, but I'm acknowledging the full human in you. So, different
Mm,
context for sure. Again, our social contracts are very different. The way
mm,
Catholicism works in Colombia is very different from how it works in North America.
mm, mm. Can a true global humanist fly in an airplane?
Well, now this is where I get pedantic and say they technically can, but
Hmm.
but
Yes.
Right.
the yeah, no, the question always has to do with the ethics of trying to live in a world that has so many issues. And there
Mm,
is always that question of how do you prioritize? So, for instance, what's the purpose for flying in an airplane? You were very vague in this particular context. If it's to go
mm,
off to an exploitative resort, to go off to exploit people in a kind of tourism that's definitely going to worsen the quality of life for somebody, that's not great. But let's say that's an emergency plane ride to be with somebody in need, to be with somebody suffering, then that might be a different context and the priorities are different. So I think the real answer there is that contextually, a global humanist is going to have to keep that as one of their options. They can't be completely rigid if they want to be able to respond to all of the kinds of needs that can arise in the world.
so
Can
maybe
it?
not
Oh,
fly to Colombia to visit an eco-tourism locale in land that was formerly held by the FARC. Would that be?
Well, the funny thing at FARC is there are two versions of FARC now. There's now peacetime FARC and dissident FARC. So it depends which group you're talking about. But it's funny how many of the FARC, when they wanted to change their image, they actually went around to some of the small communities doing gender diversity awareness and trying to raise women's rights. And so it's
Wow.
amazing. Yeah, again,
Yeah.
different conversation. We can't imagine these things because we have in North America, Republicans and Democrats can't agree on a lunch menu. But here in Colombia, you do have many very complex nuances because life just keeps going. And so you have to keep trying to find arrangements and ways to move through the problems that arise from moment to moment. So you have to be open to possibilities. Yeah.
Can a true global humanist be a socialist?
Ooh.
Yes. Oh, I'm curious as to what was behind that question. Why would you suggest that they shouldn't be a socialist?
I mean, I guess another way to phrase it could is must
Oh,
a
yeah.
true global humanist be a socialist?
Oh, yeah. In terms of the idea of socialism that we're talking about, seeking the extension of human welfare, like I often, it's fascinating because I listen to quite a few anarchist podcasts and groups right now, and it has led me to question my constant use of the idea of how we change public policy. I still very much feel we have to work with the institutions that we have. We can't just pretend they don't exist. And so I often frame humanism as something that requires maximizing human agency through better public policy. And when I do that, I realize that I am talking about a very particular framework of state relationships, a particular framework of state relationships. And the idea of anarchism that I'm talking about and that I'm referring to as a contrast is small, hyper local forms of globalism and the idea of mutual aid groups and working to improve your community and maybe not necessarily working with your state in a way that would be traditionally socialist. But that's a fun conversation because there are so many different slices of anarchism, so many different slices of socialism. So I would say, no, you don't have to be a socialist, but you are going to be seeking to improve social welfare, and that either will involve some kind of state project or an equivalent. So, yeah. But of course, to a lot of folks in the United States, socialism, it's all socialism. So I give you the answer for them will be yes,
Yeah.
but for me, it's a bit more
Well, yeah.
nuanced.
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, it just in the U.S. context, it just means bad.
yes,
It
absolutely.
doesn't have anything to do with policy prescriptions or political system. It just means bad. It's just
No,
the
yeah,
other.
exactly.
With that in mind, speaking of othering,
Ooh,
can a true global humanist wish religion would disappear?
oof. You know what? I do have days when I am extremely angry and frustrated, and I do sometimes wonder what it would be like if we were on the same page. And I think that happens to a lot of us. I think we have moments where we really just want everyone to agree with us completely on everything. Gosh, wouldn't that be so easy? So I
Well, at
think that
least about one thing.
just
That's
but when I hear that, actually, it's a really important point because when I hear that, I hear me being human, and being humanist are two different things, and it's really important to remember the difference. So in those moments, I'm being extremely human. I'm frustrated, and there's something else driving my frustration. Usually, I've had a bad encounter or I've seen something terrible in the news, and in that moment, I'm not. I don't feel like I'm being humanist. I feel like I'm being human, and my humanism has to allow for the fact that I will have human moments. But I don't think that that's actually me at my best. And I would say that within my peak on the moral landscape, that would not be optimal humanist behavior. So, no, but very human.
yes, yes, of course. And it feeds in earlier you mentioned like, religion is there because there's a need for it.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
what we want is for that need to go away, right?
Yeah, the need to go away would be wonderful. And at the same time, we were talking about one need for it. There are multiple needs. It's fascinating how many different factors are there. So it would be nice if we could sweep it all away, but we don't. I don't think we fully even scratched the surface of how many factors underpin our need for these different issues. As we've been talking about in other contexts, there are lots of secular folk who want ritual and they want the spiritual, which is not something that resonates at all for me. So I feel like even stripping away what we think of as the need behind God belief, there's so many other factors we haven't even fully developed data sets around yet. We don't know what
Yeah.
we need yet.
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay. Here's one that we like to ask.
Oh,
Can a true global humanist eat animals?
yes. Yes, they can. Yeah. I'll give you and it's I'm vegetarian at home, but I will not refuse what a grandmother serves me in her home. So that is there's a whole conversation to be had, and I've had this on my podcast on a few different episodes about the differences in food. And the fact is people don't really have diets here. because to have a diet is extremely privileged. You get to have a choice about what you put in your body. And so, absolutely, if you want to live in the world and be around other people, you need to be able to be flexible to the fact that other people have limited agency or are moving through different things. And sometimes the best thing to do is not to be confrontational. The best way to move through the world is whatever works for your whole community. Yeah.
Hmm. And finally, can a true global humanist believe people are fundamentally good?
I feel like that's a different moral peak than I'm on because I'm extremely pessimistic. So I feel like I'm looking at that, or I'm looking at that peak on the moral landscape, and I'm like, good for you, other global
Yeah.
humanists, you can do that. But I
Mm.
don't think that there is that sense of a good. We just talked about the idea of social contracts. We are environmentally constructed, very much so. And so this idea of this innate good is extremely dangerous because it allows us to continue to take that gut feeling as if it were some sort of separate, absolute, platonic ideal, and not something that's actually been formed by a body of experiences within a particular cultural context. So, if another global humanist on that other peak wants to say that, good for them. I don't think so.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
All right. You passed.
Ooh, excellent.
Turns out you are a global humanist. Who knew?
Yeah.
ML, if
Oh,
people want to find out more about you, read your work, where should they look? Where can they go? What can they find?
right now, actually, the best place is my Substack, which is, I know some people will say, oh no, Substack, that has lots of ethical issues. But again, we move through a universe of many complicated choices. So, mlclark.substack.com is the best place to tie into pretty much all my other links. I'm starting to build a booktube channel right now, but the links are always going to be connected through Substack. Podcast episodes will be posted through my Substack. So, truly, that is the best way to connect with my work at this juncture. Who knows about the rest of the social media landscape? So we'll just say Substack for now.
Right, we'll do that. And we'll link that below, of course.
Perfect.
ML, is great meeting you. This has been fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, both of you. An absolute pleasure.
Okay. That was ML Clark. Really great talking with them. Todd, what were your takeaways from that conversation?
I look, I think this is one that I just, well, one, I wasn't in the best of health. My mind wasn't at its keenest. So just going along for the ride, there's so much in there, and to get this like sort of big picture of how they look at the world, and it's something I've noticed in ML's work on Only Sky, that it's very independent and far ranging in a way that I enjoy it. There's always something to think about and chew on. So in that sense, like this wasn't a very like it wasn't very sharp. It was far ranging. It was far ranging because it's such an open life and so much is going on. It's really fantastic. I love things like that. Mostly, one of the things they brought up, this sort of more focused idea of what is important in humanism, right, and differentiating it from regional humanism, which I hadn't considered. And one of the things, or the thing that they mentioned was this idea of humanism connecting it to agency. And this is something that, again, like in it's loaded with a few things. Certainly, there is a material sense there, right? It's about focusing on the real world. But this idea that we are agents and that we need to have this sort of power, this autonomy in our life is a huge thing that we really need to bring into it. And it does distinguish us from a lot of religious views. A lot of religious views make things so you have to be either obedient or submissive to the power of a dominant being, right? We have that in some religions, not all of them. The tradition I was raised in, that was a big focus. Things are out of your hands. It also contrasts, and we see this in their work. A lot of what ML writes about, what they think about, is a lot of the Western alienation that was discussed, right? If you're going to be critical of Western media, one of the things that you people find in that is that you're completely alien to it. Actually, so I noticed this today, that the amount of sort of mainstream media consumption that I have, the main thing I consume is the weather. That's it, right? Like if I watch my local
Right.
news, the only thing I watch is the
Yeah.
weather. And so I started to interrogate this, like, okay, like this is literally the only local news I watch. I have a lot of reading I do. There are other things that I'll pick and choose to watch to get informed on. But for watching local news, the only thing I watch is the weather, and it's because it's the only thing that's useful, right? It's the only thing that contributes to my agency. It informs me how I'm going to dress, the things I can do that day, where I can go. It's how I need to prepare my home. It's incredibly useful. Nothing else in local news is at all useful. It's fires, car crashes, murders, it, and police violence. There's nothing I can do with that. It's a lot of oh dearism. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? How can we do this? And political coverage is similar, right? It becomes the drama. It's not about informing you. It's not about anything that helps you make this useful action. So thinking about it like in terms of humanism and media literacy, this notion of agency does help for me fill it's a puzzle piece, right? This project of beyond atheism, we're finding pieces that we can plug in there. This is a big part of humanism for me. That's something I
Yeah.
found.
Yeah. Just picking up on that. Yeah. One of the things that was interesting is how to think about, these big global issues and like climate change or whatever. And in some ways, I sort of think back to our conversation with Timothy Stacy a few months ago. And I sort of wonder, like, picking up on your point about the local sphere. I mean, I wonder in some cases, this is maybe a chance where we actually could make a difference though on the local level. Whereas, there's not much I can do personally about climate change. I mean, I can try to reduce my carbon footprint and all that. But there may be things where I can actually, my agency actually matters at a local level. Making small changes, working with other community members to bring about small changes that may have a practical difference in people's lives. And I think that maybe there's some interesting paradox, like between like thinking globally, but you really acting locally or something like
Yeah,
that. I don't
right.
know. Yeah, maybe
Sounds like
other
a
people
bumper
have.
sticker.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think another thing I appreciated too about the conversation was the idea ML moving to Colombia and kind of getting inspired by the fact that there's other ways of doing things, other ways of thinking about political issues, and we're not necessarily trapped by what our current political situation in North America. It may, there's other ways of organizing things in Colombia or something.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And I
cultural
think that's
imagination and
yes,
right,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the norms that are seeing that another world is possible. Yeah,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
it's
mm-hmm.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
was really thankful that they kind of decoded or just resituated, I think would be the right way to put it, the idea of like when someone prays for you and saying like, you know what, there is like it has a lot of meanings and how you respond is based on this. And you know what? Maybe it's just negative attention and that's and you don't feed the trolls. That's helpful. I appreciate that. That's probably the best answer we've heard for that one so
Mm-hmm.
far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in cases like they mentioned of when people really have nothing to give except for like the hope that God will bless you. I mean, obviously the way not to take that is to be like, don't you idiot, like don't you know
Yeah.
God is not real? I think
Yeah.
but rather to accept that they have really literally nothing they can give except that. And I think that was a valuable thing to keep in mind or think about.
Absolutely. I know. And
Yeah.
because there are so many ways to read it. I once had I was trying to give away a computer monitor. I was living in Seattle and I was outside on the sidewalk waiting for the person to come by and pick it up. And a guy, just normal looking guy, walked down the street. And, I thought he was being friendly at first. And he's like, so do you know about our Savior, Jesus Christ? And I'm like, dude, I got a computer. I'm just trying to I got this big CRT monitor. I'm just trying to give this thing away and say, hey, yeah, that's great, man. I do, but I don't have time right now. It's like, why not? Like, God, like, got really aggressive
Yeah.
about it. It's like, don't you know about don't you want to learn about saving your soul? I'm full of Christ's love. It's like, oh, I couldn't. I'm being, and he, when the woman came to pick up the monitor, he was still like getting in my face about it. I'm trying to talk to her,
Yeah.
pass this thing on. It's like, this is
Right.
crazy. So that is a
Yeah.
very, very different situation from someone
Yes.
who
Yes.
like, look, I don't have anything to offer you, and but all I can say is like, I wish for something nice to happen to you. I understand that. That's a lot different. It does show the vacuousness. This is the other thing. It really highlights how vacuous it is when the rich and powerful only offer thoughts and
Right.
prayers. Like that
Yeah, that's a
shows
great
like
point. Yeah.
how
Yeah.
truly empty that is, because you have the ability to do something and you choose to be completely powerless. So I mean, it does both of these things. It shows that it has a very different meaning in different contexts, and shows how absolutely meaningless it is, or how harm or just mean it is in other contexts. Yeah, so that's why I mean, like far-ranging, like we could have sharpened it. I mean, we talked about this, like we got to pick one thing, and no, we were like, well, let's dump the whole basket here, and I'm kind
Yeah.
of glad we did, because I
Yeah.
enjoy these.
Yeah. We can always have ML back on to
Absolutely.
talk about another
Or
issue.
we could take a road trip, Nathan. How about that?
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, we
Yeah.
can do a Beyond Atheism
Yeah.
Colombia edition.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. We've got people down there now. I think we can't really drive because there's a gap, the Darien Gap, but that's a different episode. We don't need to talk about that now. Nathan, any plugs you need to make?
We should just plug ML's Substack to find all their writing and podcasts and other stuff.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. So, and
and
that'll be linked below as well. Big supporters, of course. Hey, if you've made it this far, like and subscribe. Just smash that button down below. It's free and easy. If you happen to have a few extra ducats hanging around, you can send it our way through Patreon. Big support, especially. We love our patrons, and we love hearing from you guys. Keep the questions coming. Keep the comments coming. I guess that's it. Oh yeah, you can hit us up on the Twitter. Nathan, are you still on Twitter? Does it work anymore?
it was funny. Yeah, the other day I tried to post our new episode, and it was telling me you've exceeded your limit for tweets per day, and I couldn't tweet, but it was like a bug or something
Yeah,
because I hadn't tweeted like that day. But
4,400 times. You're still under 4,500 per day.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So, but yeah, I guess technically I'm still on Twitter.
That
Yeah, if you want to
Nate G.
find me there.
Alexander.
Yes.
And otherwise, yeah. Talk to you later. Bye bye.